So in our previous video, we went ahead and we wrote a simple random shader that allowed us to do texturing, very simple map-based texturing, and basically we only had a couple of controls for a shader. We had a control that would allow us to flip the direction of the U or the V coordinate, because as you guys saw, sometimes the data that is exported by your application doesn't match the data that you have on your texture application. So sometimes what you have to do is flip the UV coordinates before you use them. But a lot of times you want to have more control over your texturing. You might need things such as rotation or repeat or an offset. So right now we're going to go ahead and write a shader that expands on the previous one, and it allows us to do all these other things that we want to do. So right now I'm on this location, and inside this location that you can get from our GitHub location, here inside the source I have the other shader that we wrote before, the simple texture. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to make some changes to it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this source simple texture, and we're going to give it a name, texture manip.sl. So basically that stands for texture manipulation. So right now we're going to launch the editor with our texture manip, and we're going to go ahead and grow this, and we're going to make some changes here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to replace wherever we find simple texture for texture manip. So you can just use whatever search and replace your texture editor has. I'm just going to use mine here, simple texture manip. Okay, so it did 3 substitutions. So there we are. Let me go ahead and move this a little bit back. So to be able to do transformations, let's go ahead and add some of the controls that we're going to need. So in here, after flip, we're also going to add the control for repeat. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this, guys. And instead of it being flip, it's going to be repeat S, and then repeat T. Let's see. Repeat S, repeat T. Then I'm going to go ahead and make another copy of this, and we're going to paste it here, and this one's going to be offset. So we're just going to add controls for offset and offset T. Now as I look at this, I see that our repeat is set to 0, and usually what that is going to do is cancel out your texture. So you want to set your repeat to 1, because you usually want your texture to be shown at least once. And then the last control that we need, and I'm going to put it all the way up here because it usually is the first one, usually is the first operation that we're going to apply. So I'm going to go ahead and put it here. It's going to be uniform float rotate, and we're just going to give the value of 0. So that being done, actually we have all these parameters over here, and we probably need to get rid of them, because otherwise, well, you know what, no, we'll go back and we'll add the ones that we need. Actually, let's do that right now. So we have use alpha. After use alpha, we're going to need rotate, and rotate is just a regular texture. So we're going to go ahead and select this, copy it, and right after use alpha, I'm going to paste it here, and we're going to call this rotate. The default is going to be 0, and the range is going to be 0 to 360 with an increment of 0.1. That seems correct. Then after that we have our flips, and they're right there. Then we're going to copy these 2 guys. Actually, let's copy only one, because I think the parameter doesn't need to be a switch, so we might need to do this twice. Let's copy this, and this is going to be a repeat. So we're going to do repeat S, And subtype, we're going to do integer. And default is going to be 1. We're going to copy this again. And this time we're going to change the values to be t. And then the final ones we have to use is the offset. And the offset is going to be a float. So we're just going to pretty much take this guy over here. And we're going to make a copy of it. And we're going to name it accordingly. So offset s. Default is 0. Range, we don't really need a range because, you know, we can offset this as big as we want. We don't need to restrict that. And we're going to do offset t. Right? So now we have all our GUI information for our parameters. We have our parameter definition here on the shader, but we still haven't implemented this. So this whole area is pretty empty. So what we're going to do, the first operation we're going to apply is a rotation, because usually transformations, the way they're applied is first you rotate, then you scale, and then you transform. There's a reason for this, and we're probably going to have another video that goes over transformations and explain why the order in which you apply these operations makes a big difference. So because of that, the first thing we're going to do is apply a rotation. Now, to apply a rotation, it involves a little bit of math, and I'm going to show you guys what we're going to use, but I'm not going to go that much into the proof of it because, you know, the scope of this tutorial, it might be a little bit out of the scope of this tutorial. So for that, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a C macro. And you do that by typing in the # and typing the word define. And then you're going to give the macro name. We're going to call it rotate 2D because it's a two-dimensional rotation. And this macro is going to take several parameters. The first one is going to be the x and y, which is the position of you know, the s coordinate and the t coordinate. Then it's going to take rad, which is the angle in radians, the angle in radians that you want to rotate your texture. Then it's going to take ox, oy, which is the origin over which you want to rotate the texture in s or in t. And then finally you're going to have Rx and Ry, which is the output texture that has been rotated. Whenever you're doing macros and you want to do multi-line, you have to always add a slash at the end, a backslash, and you can't have any spaces or any character afterwards. So that there. Now we're going to continue our macro, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to type Rx. So basically with this value will be replaced with whatever you put here. I'm sorry, over here. And it's going to be replaced before the shader is compiled. So I'm going to go ahead and open a parentheses and just do x minus ox, and then close parentheses times the cosine of rad, and then this is going to go minus, and then we open a couple of these, y minus oy. We're going to close this, then times sine of radius plus the origin of x. Right? So that's going to be setting the rotated x coordinate, which is, you know, the s coordinate. So we're going to do the same one for the y, and basically the y is going to be ry equals, open a couple, and then here we do x minus ox, sorry, times sine of rad plus, the previous one was minus, this one is plus. I'm going to put a space here, and then we give it a y minus oy. We close this again, we got times cosine of rad plus oy. So this right there is, I forgot this one over here. So this is the macro that we're going to be using. There you have it. I went ahead and give it a save. So to use this macro, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make a little bit of changes to what this shader did. We're going to go in here, and instead of applying the flips right here, we're going to go ahead and take this S out of here. And we're going to first define the S and T. So we're going to do float SS equals TT equals 0. Basically, this is a shorthand for doing quick initialization of a couple of variables that are of the same type. So now we're going to call our rotate. So I'm going to do here texture rotation, and we're going to type rotate 2D, and then we're going to give it the incoming texture coordinates. So it's going to be S and T, which are the base ones. Then we're going to type the word radians. And what this is going to allow us to do is going to allow the user to pass the parameter in degrees, because this function, what it does is it takes a value in degrees and it switches it to radians, and our operation is in radians. So we're going to do radians rotate, right? And where did that rotate come from? It comes from up here. Basically, we're using our shader parameter right in here. So we put it there. Then we're going to look at the origin. Let me get down here. So the next part of this call is going to be the origin. And I usually like to rotate my textures around the center, and you can expose this to a parameter if you want. But for simplicity, we're going to go ahead and make sure that our texture always rotates about the center. And then finally, we're going to say, this function is going to store the output in whatever variable we give it, and the variable that I'm going to give it is SS and TT. So by the end of this call, basically, you are going to have your textures rotated. So the S and T is going to be rotated by whatever degree you give it, around the center of the texture coordinate, and it's going to store the value in ST. So the first thing we're going to do is a rotation. The next step, next operation, we're going to do a flip. And we're going to have to change this from SS to TT. Once we've done the flip, we're going to do a texture repeat. And there's different ways to do a texture repeat. One technique is to do a modulus. Another technique is to just multiply the texture domain, which basically makes the texture domain become a lot smaller and repeat itself over a given span. So we're going to use the multiplication method, because when you're dealing with texture maps and you're using a modulus function, you tend to get filtering artifacts on the edge of the texture being repeated. So for this, we're just going to go ahead and do texture repeat, and we're going to do something as simple as SS times equal repeat S, and TT times equals repeat T. Okay, so we have rotated, flipped, and repeated the texture. Now the last operation we need to do is an offset, and an offset is pretty simple also. Texture offset. And it's going to be SS plus equals offset S, and TT plus equals offset T. So there you go. That pretty much has allowed us to rotate, flip, repeat, and offset our texture. And then we go ahead and use the texture right there, and the rest of the shader is pretty much exactly the same way as it used to be. So we're going to go ahead and give this a compile and hope we don't have any errors. And yeah, we got a whole bunch of errors over here. Let's see what's going on. Undeclared variable reference TT on line 87. So let's give it a look. Let's go ahead and change this. Actually, let's go ahead and, just for simplicity, let's go ahead and do S equals 0, float TT equals 0. Let's try compiling again. And this time, you see one little error spawned a whole bunch of errors over here. But once we fix it, basically now we have the shader in both formats, in renderment format and in 3D Light format. So we're going to go here inside of our file that you'll be able to find in our GitHub location. And if you go over here and load that shader, let me go and find it. I'm going to find the shader is texture manip SLO. So we found that shader, and here we have our user interface. I'm going to go ahead and load the texture, and the texture is located in the text folder, and I have to actually put this to all files so I can select it. So the texture is the TX file. So there we go. So now if we hit render, okay, I see the behavior is flipped. So let's go ahead and start testing this thing. First of all, let's flip it. Render again. Okay, the flip behaves. Now what happens if we rotate this by 90 degrees? We rotate. There you go. The texture is rotating. So the rotation is working. Let's try the flip T. Okay, those two are working. And now let's try to do a repeat. And let me hit render here really quick. Let me rotate this back. So I like to see the logo straight, otherwise I'm starting to turn my face. So repeat S. Let's do 2 repetitions. If we hit enter, if we hit render, you're going to see this. It squished the texture in the on the X direction, and so it looks elongated. That's because we're repeating on, we're repeating on different values. So if we tell it to repeat T on 2 also, we're probably going to see the texture just go up all the way here in this corner. Now, why isn't repeating? The reason why it isn't repeating is because when we created the texture, let's see, here's where I am right now. So I am in the texture location. When we created the texture, we just went and we did something like this: tx make tdc texture.tiff, and then we did tdc texture.tx. Well, the default behavior for a texture is that whenever it goes outside the limits of the texture, it will just return 0. It would return 0 on all the channels. And we are going beyond the boundaries of the texture, because when you do a multiplication, what you're doing is you're telling it, like if you have this point over here, and this here represents the texture coordinates. And as you can see, they go from 0 to 1. Well, if you multiply it by 2, instead of being from 0 to 1, it's going to be from 0 to 2. And the value of 1 is going to land somewhere right here in the middle. So that's pretty much what's happening in our lookup over here. The value of 1 is somewhere around here, and somewhere around here around T. So basically, the texture outside those bounds is just returning 0. So the shader is not able to display any color, or even worse, it doesn't have any alpha information, so it's not able to layer it. So how do we get around this? Basically, whenever you have a texture that you know you're going to need to tile, you do this texture call with this flag. You say -mode, and you tell it periodic. And usually periodic means that it will have the ability to replicate. So once it goes outside the bounds, it's going to repeat whatever was, like if you are in position 1.5, it's going to give whatever it was at position 0.5, because it's just going to do a periodic. It's going to repeat itself. So if we go back here and we hit render, there you go. Now the texture is a tileable texture, and you are able to see the effects of our repeat. There's one more mode, which instead of periodic, it's called, let's look it up, tx make. There's another mode, if you go over here, that is clamp. So if we do the same call as before, and instead of periodic, we tell it to clamp. Now if I render, it's going to find whatever is the last pixel in the edge, and it's going to extend this. So the last pixel on our image is, is transparent and has no value. That's why we're not seeing it. But if our texture had information all the way to the last pixel, it's going to take that last pixel and it's going to stretch it into infinity. Also, something else about the mode. You're seeing me do something like this, mode periodic, and this affects the mode in the S and in the T. But if you look at the help documentation that this spits out when you do tx make -h, you have an S mode and a T mode. So you have the ability to S mode periodic, and then minus T mode. Let's do black, right? So if I do this, hold on, I think I did something wrong. Okay, yeah, I have to get rid of this. And black, and if I hit enter, now if I render, it's going to tell, it should tell in only one direction unless I made a mistake here. Periodic, let's get rid of this one. And render this. What's going on here? Let's see. It's saying bad texture data. Well, let's close this. Let's go back over here. Oh, pediotic. I don't know what pediotic is. That's why it's freaking out, I think. Periodic. Okay, so we made this, and let's see if this makes it work. There you go. So right now, the texture tiles in only one direction because we told it to be periodic only on S. So I'm just trying to show you that you have the ability of control the behavior of the texture outside the boundary. So the default is to be black, which means anything outside is black. You can make them periodic or clamp. And if you want to make it periodic in both edges, then all you do is use txmake minus mode periodic, and then just hit that. And when you hit render, it's going to repeat. So that being done, let's look at one more component. Let's go ahead and do a 45-degree rotate and see how that looks. So it should be tiled and rotated. And now finally what you can do is start doing an offset. So if I do 0.5 and I render, you see it's going to start moving things around a little bit. Let me do a smaller value so it's something's more apparent. And look at like the detail of where this ends. If I render again, you see it's moving on the S. And if I set this back to 0 and I render, you can see I'm shifting it on S, but on T it still lines up perfectly down here. Well, let's give that an offset now. And if I hit render, now it's offsetting it in that direction. So there you have it. That's pretty much all we have to do to make things behave. So the shader is here. We went through, and basically what we did is first we did a rotation, then we did a flip, then we did a repeat, and finally we did an offset. And then after that, the shader is pretty much the exact same shader we use for simple texturing. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions, go to our Q&A section, post your questions, and we'll try to answer your questions as soon as possible. Well, thank you very much, and see you guys later.